It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Firebuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, some time ago, I looked at 1942's Cat People, which was produced by Val Lewton at RKO with director Jacques Tourneur. And I talked a little bit about that relationship between Lewton and RKO, but I think it bears to discuss once again. Lewton spent the 30s as a writer. He started with pulp novels, but eventually went to MGM's publicity office to create novelization of popular movies. These novelizations would be serialized in magazines first, and then later collected as novels. One of Lewton's claim to fame at MGM was supposedly saying that David O. Selznick was trying to adapt an unadaptable novel into a movie, and he was making the biggest mistake in his career. The film was Gone with the Wind. But despite that, in 1942, Lewton was placed in charge of RKO's horror unit. And he had a simple set of rules that he had to follow. First, each film had to be made on less than a $150,000 budget. Second, each film had to be less than 75 minutes. Third, Lewton would be given the titles to work with before production began. Lewton's first film was Cat People, and it was made for somewhere just under $135,000, and it turned out to be RKO's biggest hit of that year by a pretty good margin. What's interesting are those titles. They're catchy titles. However, Lewton and Tourneur would make these more psychological and existential in nature. I still say you can make the argument that everything in Cat People is only to make you think the girl turns into a cat person, but in actuality, she's just maybe a weirdo who mimics cats when she has a psychotic break. The second film that Lewton produced for RKO, and the second of the three films for the duo that we're going to be talking about this week, is I Walked with a Zombie. And the title for this movie was lifted from an article title from American Weekly magazine written by Inez Wallace. Now, the article by Wallace was not about actual, undead ghouls, nor was it really about the much more common form at that time, the zombies created by voodoo mind and body control. Yes, she did go to Haiti. Yes, she went to a plantation and encountered people whose minds were so addled that they could only really understand simple commands and obey them. But it wasn't reanimation or voodoo that created the situation. Instead, it was through heavy drug use among the workers on the plantation. Now, Lewton, not only did he come back with Tourneur, but he also turned to two screenwriters to do some research about Haitian voodoo. One of those writers, Ardell Ray, was a writer who Lewton would partner with on more RKO films. The other was Kurt Siodmak. Now, Siodmak was one of the bigger names in horror in the 40s. He worked on a lot of Universal movies and provided the script for what is likely not just his most famous horror screenplay, but probably what most people would consider his masterpiece, The Wolfman. Now, I would argue that maybe this is more of a better and more accurately called a masterpiece, but there's something kind of interesting about both The Wolfman and this movie, and how it takes certain traditions and certain different types of people very seriously. But he's an excellent writer, and he shows it again here. But when the film was released in April of 1943, the movie had a lot of mixed reviews. Some found the film to be kind of dull, while others found it to be exactly the spine chiller it was sold as, and even compared it to Cat People. The New York Times was not entertained by the film. The reviewer from that paper called it a disgusting exaggeration of an unhealthy, abnormal concept of life. That sounds exactly like the kind of horror film that I would like to watch. But when I say that that Siodmak kind of took stuff very seriously about a certain group of people, I now have to kind of wonder if unhealthy, abnormal concept of life was a jab at voodoo, which would have been obviously quite racist of the New York Times to do at the time. But much later, now in retroactive and retrospective reevaluation, the film is actually very well liked. It has a pretty high Rotten Tomatoes score. TV Guide gives the movie 5 out of 5 stars. Leonard Maltin calls it an exceptional Val Lewton chiller. And in 2007, it was named the 5th best zombie film of all time by Stylist magazine. In fact, Stylist ranked it one place higher than most people's number one, Night of the Living Dead. So it might not have been well liked in 1943, but in modern times, it's considered another big time classic of the era, just like its predecessor, Cat People. Now, this movie opens with Betsy Connell telling her story. Now, she is a nurse from Ottawa. She's being interviewed for a job to care for the wife of Mr. Paul Holland, and he owns a sugar plantation. And then she's not so sure about going to a Caribbean island for her job. But the pay is pretty good, but she's also not so sure about this question that she's asked by Holland's recruiter. He asked her if she believes in witchcraft. However, she is won over when he explains how nice it would be to live on a Caribbean island where she can spend her off hours on the beach under a palm tree. And it's a pretty far cry from the snowy weather just outside the window in Ottawa, Canada. But on the boat, she meets with Holland, and as she thinks about the beauty of the sea and the area in this area of the world, he basically just steps up to her and tells her there is no beauty here. The fish she's marveling at, jumping out of the water, aren't doing so for artistry or beauty, but out of fear of being eaten by bigger fish. No, he says that there's only death and decay in this part of the world. On the way to the plantation, Betsy speaks to the coachman who tells her the story of the people here of this island. They were brought here as slaves to work the sugarcane fields. She's concerned about the stillness and the quiet at the plantation. And in fact, when dinner comes that evening, she only dines with Holland's half-brother, Wesley Rand. While they get acquainted, they hear the eerie beats of the so-called jungle drums, as signifying work about to take place at the sugar mill. Now, that night before bed, Betsy sees a woman in white walking outside. After she goes to bed, she hears the sound of a woman sobbing and decides to investigate. And she tracks the sobbing to a dark building with a kind of a creepy winding staircase. Betsy goes upstairs but finds no one. However, following her is the woman in white, who is unresponsive and seemingly in a trance. And she is identified as Jessica Holland, the wife she was sent there to care for. Betsy's scream as Jessica creepily kind of corners her in the upstairs part of the Stark building, that brings Mr. Holland out to gather his wife. And Betsy is told the woman who is crying is the maid Alma. The reason for her crying is due to an old tradition on the island. Every new baby born is wept over by the residents of the island. Holland and Betsy discuss the events of the previous evening, and Betsy says that she wasn't aware that Jessica was a mental case. And Holland says that she needs to remember that Jessica is indeed a mental case, because the locals will tell her all sorts of weird stories and voodoo legends and gossip and stuff. And she's not to take that seriously. She then meets with Dr. Maxwell, who is the actual doctor for Jessica. And he tells Betsy that Jessica got a tropical fever that damaged her spinal cord. And he says that she's basically a zombie. She's a sleepwalker who cannot be awoken. And basically all they can do is to keep her comfortable until she eventually dies of natural causes. Now, Betsy walks around the island on her day off and runs into Wesley. And while they have a couple of drinks at a cafe, soon they hear a calypso singer singing a song about Paul and Wesley. Apparently, the song speaks a little bit about how Paul had a wife whose heart was stolen by Wesley, and maybe vice versa. Maybe the wife was kind of playing the two off of each other. But this pisses Wesley off, and he begins drinking heavily and eventually passes out. And as Betsy tries to wake Wesley up to go back to the plantation, the singer comes back and finishes the song. And there's talk about how Jessica was going to run away with Wesley, but something evil happened that hollowed her out, and now Wesley is driven to drink over everything. Paul does admit to Betsy later that there was an ugly scene before Jessica got sick. He did threaten to keep her there by force if he had to in order to keep her from leaving with his brother. Betsy goes for a walk and reveals through her inner thoughts that she's now fallen in love with Paul. She says that she knows Paul still loves Jessica, so to prove her love for him, she'll restore his wife. It's the only thing she can give him. So she and Dr. Maxwell propose an insulin shock treatment to take a shot at curing Jessica, and the insulin will put her into a coma, and then they will use shock treatment to revive her from the coma. Now, Maxwell does say that there is a chance it will kill her, but there's just an equal chance that it will restore her as well. And considering her state, there is no chance of curing her without the treatment anyway. So Paul reluctantly agrees, but ultimately the treatment fails. Jessica still remains in her vegetative state. Alma suggests that maybe Betsy should take Jessica to the voodoo temple to have the priest try to save her by speaking to their gods and to their spirits. So Betsy goes to speak to Mrs. Rand, who she had met previously. She's the mother of Paul and Wesley, and she asks about whether or not Mrs. Rand believes in voodoo and if it has any power or if it can help cure the sick. Now, Mrs. Rand tries to discourage Betsy from going to the temple, basically saying, they're primitive people. They're not going to, they might do some things that might really scare you or concern you. But Betsy is determined to do this, so she sneaks out with Jessica anyway. And Alma provides these little patches that she pins onto Betsy and Jessica to basically to allow them passage into the temple. And they walk through a field where they eventually come into contact with Carrefour, and he's like a guard-like zombie who basically just stands on the path. Think of him almost like the guy who takes you across the river Styx. You have to basically get past him and not be considered a threat to be able to get to the temple. And he does allow them to pass, even though at one point Betsy did lose her patch in the field as they were walking towards the temple. Now, Betsy speaks to the spirit, with the spirit Damballa, who is part of the voodoo tradition. However, Mrs. Rand has intercepted her by basically revealing that she's inside this little confessional where people are talking to the spirit, and reminds her that Jessica cannot be cured, and especially cannot be cured by voodoo. She explains how she is able to convince the islanders to be healthier by speaking to them as if their gods are speaking through her. So that's why she's here. She was only trying to keep her away to try to prevent her from having any hope that the voodoo practices can cure Jessica. She actually works rather closely with the voodoo temple and the various practitioners. However, while the two talk, one of the men in the ritual stabs Jessica's arm with a sword, and she does not bleed, which causes the islanders to think Jessica is not sick, but actually truly a zombie. When Jessica and Betsy return to the fort, Paul reveals to Betsy that it's nice that she's trying to do all of this, but he no longer loves Jessica. And, he's just trying to do right by her by keeping her comfortable, basically. The voodoo practitioners are now somewhat obsessed with Jessica. They continue to do tests at the temple to basically try to lure her to them. And for her safety, Dr. Maxwell and Mrs. Rand want to basically move Jessica to a different island. And Paul wants Betsy to return to Canada. He feels that any longer there, she's going to become just as sad and upset as he is how he tries to sell it. But that night, Carrefour is sent to retrieve Jessica to bring her back to the temple. However, he's confused when Betsy puts on Jessica's robe to investigate the noises he's making as he shuffles about outside. Mrs. Rand is able to order him back to the temple to save Betsy. The next day, Maxwell tells Paul that with all the hubbub around Jessica and the voodoo business, the commissioner is now opening a formal investigation as to what's going on with Jessica and what is it about her. Was it something done to her, or is it something that was truly an illness that was caused? Now, Mrs. Rand says that she can clear everything up. She tells Maxwell, Paul, Wesley, and Betsy that Jessica is actually dead. Mrs. Rand admits, and even though Dr. Maxwell denies that he ever saw her in a dead state, so he doesn't really believe this, but Mrs. Rand admits that she became possessed during a voodoo ceremony, and she asked the priest to do something to Jessica. She was mad at Jessica for tearing apart her family and causing her sons to be, to basically hate one another. And in order to make someone a zombie, the person has to die first. And Mrs. Rand implies that the fever actually killed Jessica, that the voodoo priest cursed her to have the fever. It actually killed her, and then she was then reanimated as a zombie. Later, Jessica is summoned by the voodoo priest, and Wesley says that they know how to call Jessica to them. And he's the only one who believes the voodoo story his mother told. And after Paul and Betsy basically close off the gate to prevent her from getting out to go to the voodoo priest, Wesley basically asks asks Betsy to put Jessica out of her misery and essentially euthanize her. But Betsy refuses, saying, she took the Hippocratic Oath. She cannot. She can't do what he's asking, even if it might be the right thing to do. She can't do it. When the voodoo priest tries again to summon Jessica, Wesley does help her by opening the gate on the plantation so that she can go there. He then follows her, bringing with him an arrow that sticks out of the figurehead of the Holland family ship that is now like basically the centerpiece of a fountain at the plantation. It was a depiction of Saint Sebastian, who is somebody who has 2 arrows sticking out of him. But when the priest stabs the voodoo doll of Jessica with a pin, Wesley stabs Jessica with the arrow, killing her. To avoid Carrefour, who's now in pursuit of Wesley and Jessica's body, Wesley takes her body and walks into the sea, where he commits suicide. Their bodies are later discovered and brought back to Paul's house, where Paul, Mrs. Rand, and Betsy mourn. Now let's get to the 3 things I like about I Walked with a Zombie. Now I will say this is a fantastic movie. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about that. It's hard to narrow down just 3 things. I could just say all 3 things are everything about the movie, or I can get a little bit more granular, but let's do that. First, there's a lot of really neat and eerie elements to set up the St. Sebastian Island and the people who are there. And what's kind of neat about these early parts of this movie is that, and actually this kind of continues through most of the movie, you don't spend a whole lot of time in scenes where we have bright, sunny, and happy lighting. Most of this movie takes place at night. So there is an eerie kind of stillness to it, even when it's windy, because there are a couple of times where they comment on the hot wind that's blowing. It rustles leaves, and it just creates this kind of eerie vibe to the whole movie. This is a Caribbean island, too, so ostensibly it's meant to be warm, inviting, and relaxing. However, the early bits of the movie are hardly that. And the mystery, what ultimately kind of keeps Betsy kind of interested in the place is the mysteries that happen, starting with learning about the voodoo stuff and the second half of the movie. But the movie opens with Betsy in snowy Canada, Well, that's cold and uninviting, and it makes you want to get out of there. And then she's lured to St. Sebastian by the idea that it's a tropical island. However, we next see her on the boat at night. And while there is beauty in the night, especially how the moonlight, kind of shimmers off of the sea, the others on the boat are not happy. They seem weary. They seem tired. They seem downtrodden almost. Holland talks of only death and decay and ugliness. And once she gets to the island, she's brought to the plantation during the day, but it's mostly filmed in tighter framing, so we don't see too much outside of the coach. It's dark when dinner comes on her first night, and she comments on the stillness and the uneasy quiet of the plantation home. Then that night she hears the woman crying and sees Jessica, who looks more like a ghost. It's all nicely atmospheric to make you uneasy about the location and what Betsy is there to do. In fact, she's not given too much information about anything for a while after she arrives. It's ominous from the beginning and uses everything from the location, the time of day, the stillness of the place, and the way Holland acts in direct conflict to Betsy's more wide-eyed optimism and just wanting, to do her job to help somebody. And, really kind of wanting to know more about this place and looked at it as more of a paradise originally. So it does a really good job to kind of make you uneasy from the very beginning. Second, admittedly, I kind of love the Paul Holland character. He's so sad and negative. The first time we see him, he's providing a rebuttal to Betsy's claim that the tropical sea is beautiful. Now, mind you, she was only thinking about this. She didn't tell him this directly. He just walks up to her and says that he can tell what she was thinking because she was new. Everybody new is charmed by the beauty. And he tells her about how everyone cries and sobs when a new baby is born on the island because it's such a horrible place and such a sad place. And after meeting Jessica, Betsy commented on her beauty, and Paul asks her if she considered herself pretty, which she does. And then he asks her if she considers herself charming, to which Betsy says that she hadn't really given it too much thought. So Paul tells her not to give it too much thought, as it will only save a bunch of people a bunch of heartache. It's hard to find the right word to describe Holland. He's not necessarily mean. He's not really threatening in the traditional sense. Yes, he admits that he was mean to Jessica when she was wanting to leave. But at the same time, it's like we also find out later that maybe Jessica was kind of a little wretched and really was kind of playing both Paul and Wesley against each other. But still, he's really just kind of a sourpuss. He had a beautiful wife. He had a plantation. He had riches, ostensibly. He owned a sugarcane field, which was pumping out a lot of stuff in the mill. People generally seem to like him, even though his family did own slaves. But he's been brokenhearted. So it's, he's kind of looking at the world in such a negative way. He's just a sad person, and he is himself enslaved by the family's darker history at the island and stuff that has involved him personally. So it's an interesting idea to look at in terms of guilt and shame and sadness in a place full of slaves that his family owned in the past. And, basically feeling that he's, and he knows that his family had punished them and God knows what else. It's a pretty forward thinking way to kind of lace this story with these ideas 80 years ago. It's a long time before people really thought about these sorts of things publicly. And third, this is generally an extremely compelling and very good movie. It uses the atmosphere and the characters' personalities and motivations and dialogue to help kind of build something that is uneasy and kind of gets under your skin. At the halfway point, the movie really kicks into a different gear when Jessica and Betsy arrive at the voodoo temple. There's a ceremony that is odd to the outsider, but is also not seemingly dangerous to those around. Yes, they do become obsessed with Jessica because, well, if she truly is a zombie, then, obviously voodoo has been used on her. So, but it doesn't really play to stereotypes as much as it just kind of plays up, aspects of witchcraft, particularly in that area and the voodoo practices. The point is that Siodmak and Ray, with the script and Luton and Tournaire on the production side, didn't want to make some cheap monster movie that likely would have also been highly offensive to the Afro-Caribbean characters and stereotypes. Instead, they let most of the creepiness come from Jessica's story. And as the movie continues, the real centerpiece of that movie is the voodoo ritual that Betsy takes her to. It's shot so well and kind of interesting. It's not something meant to worry the mainly white audience that people are, that these two white women are in trouble. We are simply being witness to the voodoo ritual. For a 70-minute movie, it's incredibly well crafted and well written. It takes the plot and the ideas, which would have been strange and quite frankly, seemingly typically would have been done in a racist way in 1943, and took it very seriously. It's very much, one of the true gems of the genre in the 40s. I mean, it was very clear that Luton and Tournaire knew how to make incredibly interesting horror films, unlike anything else at the time. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. And don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. And you can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. This week, we walked with a zombie, but next time we find ourselves in the clutches of the Night Walker. Until next week, stay spooky.